What has been the impact of sharing your struggles with alcoholism?
Many of my colleagues and certainly my closest colleagues are familiar with my struggles. Lots aren't and will be now. I wouldn't want to suggest in the least that writing this book, was a project that I was devoted to in order to be able to recover. That's not what drove it, and I haven't thought about it in those terms, but definitely as an exercise in taking accountability in ways that I haven't before. That aspect of me, which is absolutely central to who I am and really, at the heart of so many formative experiences for me and ongoing day-to-day experiences of the world, that doesn't have to be hidden anymore. It would have meant something to me as an 18-year-old to have a professor talk openly about their struggle and the reasons that they were attempting to live alcohol-free.
Being an artist can be a heck of a ride, but you're not alone. On Journey of the Art, we tell inspiring stories of artists and chat with those who support us on this path. I'm your host, Lola Opatayo, writer, editor, singer, and all-round lover of words. Come with me on the journey. Hello and welcome to the show. Today's episode is on the subject of crisis, creativity, and honesty. And this is perhaps going to be one of the most heartfelt episodes you've heard on the podcast, so I hope you stick around. My guest is James Cairns, a writer and professor at Wilfrid Laurier University who lives with his family in Paris, Ontario, on land covered by the Haldimand Treaty of 1784. He's the author of several books on political theory and social movements, and a staff writer for the Hamilton Review of Books. James's essay, My Struggle and My Struggle, appears in the Best Canadian Essays 2025 anthology. Today, I am so glad to have James to discuss his recent work in Crisis on a Crisis. Welcome to the show, James.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
I'm very glad to have you here. Well, before we get started, I'd like to remind you that you can find Journey of the Art wherever you get your podcasts. So please follow and rate the show and leave a comment. This really helps to boost our visibility so more folks like you can discover and join the community. If you'd like to stay connected, you can also follow the show on Instagram at Journey of the Art Pod. So James, here we go.
Great.
What is one word that describes your life as an artist and why?
That's a great question, and not one I have ever thought about before. And while I guess I start with my mind going to all kinds of words that we associate with tortured artists, like anguish or anxious or nervous or anything else, in fact, the word would be fulfilling, meaningful, rewarding. And those are three words, and I've been known to use a few. Well, I mean, I think that the art, to the extent that I think of myself as an artist or the work that I do is art, it's the written word and it's writing. And I have learned about myself probably over the last 25 years, not so much when I was in my younger childhood years or into my teens, but maybe into my 20s and 30s, and certainly since then, that I feel most able to understand what I think about the world and what I think about myself when I have the chance to write it down. And not just write it down, but write it down and work on it and finesse it and rewrite it and have my thinking advanced or corrected, challenged, shifted by what I have attempted to say, what I thought I was going to say. And through the process of revision, rethinking, rewriting, and ultimately sharing what I've written, I feel the closest that I ever feel to having achieved some kind of alignment with the core of who I am
Mm,
and the world in which I live. And
mm,
it's kind of a funny thing, I find, as someone who is um, employed as a professor and does a lot of talking uh, for a living, and who I think has a reputation for being a fine talker in front of the classroom. I have perfected the art of seeming like I know more than I do. I, can project my voice, and I'm enthusiastic about what I teach. Um, and yet, there is an uncertainty or a sense of never being quite sure that I've hit it correctly, always
mm,
when I'm speaking in front of the class, and certainly in intimate relationships, including with people that I'm very close with. And as I'm beginning to do now in this answer, and will try not to do over the course of our conversation, I can certainly ramble and, circle back and try again when I'm speaking aloud. And I think that the way in which writing allows the space to experiment with ideas at the
mm,
mode of inquiry and the mode of figuring things out before the moment of expression, representation, articulation, in order to be able to get that just so, makes me feel in my art, in my writing, far more clear and certain and satisfied with
mm.
what I want to say, which is ultimately the thoughts I have about myself and the world. And so
Right.
when that happens, and I'm able to write something that feels as though I have achieved that sense of clarity and alignment, that is very fulfilling.
Right. And I can relate to that. Um, I can relate to that. I think sometimes I have struggled with being able to express myself vocally,
Mm,
but I felt a sense of safety, and I felt like I'm at home when I write
hmm.
because I've crafted it just so. Every cadence, every
Yes.
space, every punctuation is expressing all of my emotions in a structured and, like you said, aligned manner. So I totally get that.
That's interesting from
That
you as a person who is both a podcaster but also a singer, and so
yeah.
you don't feel that same sense of confidence when you engage in those
Oh
forms of art.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, hmm, I think it depends. It depends. So with singing, it's first of all, is my voice ready for the song?
Hmm.
Sometimes it isn't, and then I'm a ball of anxiety. Like oh my gosh, I hope my voice doesn't crack. And sometimes it does. And then I try to catch myself in the middle of the performance.
Mm-hmm.
Or sometimes I'm speaking and my lips aren't moving as fast as my brain is
Mm,
going.
mm,
So sometimes I do feel that sense of um unfulfillment,
mhm,
I would
mhm.
say. But it's just different when you write. Like when
Mhm,
you are settled and I'm alone with my thoughts, my computer is on my laps, and I have canceled out several words and I've put the words are on the page are the words that I want to say.
yes, yes,
So
precisely.
everything fits exactly as I want it to be. So
Mhm,
that's why I understand that response.
mhm, mhm.
So your work in Crisis on Crisis is what I would call a study of crisis and the elements that bring an individual or society to a place of crisis.
Mhm.
Where did it come from? And can you describe the moment when you felt ready to share this with the world?
Yeah, I remember very clearly the first um uh, inklings that this was going to be something beyond um just scratching an itch of curiosity. And it was during the first Trump presidency, uh about halfway through, there were suddenly a great number of books and articles published about what was then called the crisis of democracy that we were living through.
Mm.
There were a number of really actually popular political science texts that even made the talk show circuit and were sort of out there in the zeitgeist. One in particular called How Democracy Ends by a couple of professors in the States. And when I began seeing those titles and finding myself thinking, this is really um, it's a moment that people have begun to think about as being a rupture or a break with what's come before.
Mm.
Widely, many people are thinking this, not just from one or the other side of the political spectrum. There's both people on the left and on the right. There's mainstream news organizations as well as radical publications that are talking about the crisis of democracy. And at some point, I found myself thinking, okay, Trump is odious and the policies are um, racist and sexist and deepen inequality in ways that are terribly harmful.
Mhm.
But that was true of the last president and the one before that and every other president in US history. What is so different about this moment is what has led people to argue that we're at a crisis point that's markedly new. And so it was at that moment, it was sort of my interest as a political scientist to dig in to understand when we talk about the crisis of democracy, are we talking about a system that is on the edge of collapse and could disappear sort of within the next 2 years? Are we and some were, some political scientists were, are we talking about, we're using the word crisis to mean the total collapse of an existing system and the slide into authoritarianism? Some said fascism. And yes, lots of people were using that um, uh, meaning as well.
Mm.
But then there was all kinds of people that really just sort of meant we were in a bad patch, or, like things were uncertain and frustrating.
Yeah.
And so I began reading more into the theory of the concept of crisis and examples of how the term has been used in a range of different scholarship over many different years, from a famous work on crisis by a German historian in the 1950s, way back to its earliest usage in ancient Greece, which was where the term originally comes from. And my what I kind of realized was that my interest that had begun with Trump and the question of 2018-19 had really blossomed into something that was much more, much richer or much more conceptual. And I could sense that feeling, and maybe you've had the same one, when you just know that an idea has there's something to it, like that has
Mm.
legs. It's there. You're
Yeah.
going to pursue this. And it was around that time that I uh, once, while reading an article that was on these competing different usages of the term crisis, it suddenly hit me in a way that I really hadn't thought about before, in sort of a fully formed manner, that part of what my obsession with this study was, was the way in which the idea of crisis as a moment of extreme instability and danger, where the future could either be one of recovery and rebirth or death, disaster, catastrophe. That
Yeah.
sort of dynamic was very familiar to me in my own life as someone who struggled with alcoholism for about 25 or so years. And that, on the one hand, while my academic training in political science and the courses I teach on social movements and political theory were one track upon which I was pursuing these questions, there was this urgent interest in the concept of crisis and its applicability to my own personal situation as someone who has gone in and out of periods of extreme instability, danger, harm, then to climb back toward recovery, rebirth,
Mhm.
safety, stability, and achieved some success, only to have things collapse again and go
Mhm.
through different cycles of addiction and sobriety.
Mhm.
And at that moment, I think it was clear that I had the opportunity to write a book about crisis that would fulfill these two different but overlapping interests and pressing questions of mine.
Mhm.
And I'll certainly say that had I been at a different stage in my career, a junior professor, someone without secure contract, I think that if I had been someone lacking in the kind of familial support and friendship networks and the long experience that I've had in counseling and so on, I likely wouldn't have made this choice. I'm not saying that it's just as easy as any and all of us are able to bear our souls on the page without concern for consequences. I don't think that's true. I write from a position of privilege. And yet, I could use that position to be able to write something differently than I had written before. And
Yeah.
I went from there.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting that you talked about writing from privilege because the first thing I thought while I was reading was this was a very daring thing for James to have done. And so I have a question here about what that has been like. What has been the impact of sharing your struggles with alcoholism, particularly on your work relationships?
Well, I think that it remains to be seen in some cases, because while many of my colleagues and certainly my closest colleagues are familiar with my struggles, lots aren't and will be now. Um, I welcome that for a couple of different reasons. One being, again, well, this is sort of jumping ahead a little bit, but I mean, I I wouldn't want to suggest in the least that writing this book, was a project that was devoted to in order to be able to recover or to like, that's not what drove it, and I haven't thought about it in those terms, but definitely as an exercise in taking accountability in ways that I haven't before publicly. And so when I say I welcome it, I mean, I think that for the first time, I will be able to be my full self with all of
Mm,
my colleagues, all of my students, um, uh, extended family, and so on. Which isn't to say I need to be talking about my drinking all the time, but it's to say that that aspect of me, which is absolutely central to who I am and really,
mm,
at the heart of so many formative experiences for me and
mm.
ongoing day-to-day experiences of the world, that doesn't have to be hidden anymore. And that's a relief.
Right.
And the idea that that's one more piece of the scaffolding that holds up an alcohol free life, because there isn't this secret life that I can retreat into without the difficulty of confronting uh, anyone and everyone with the truth of the complexity of who I am. So
Right.
I welcome it on those terms, but also because, again, there's a way in which what I'm going to say can sound really self-congratulatory, and it's not what I mean. And yet it is meaningful nonetheless to be able to be someone at the front of the room who is an accomplished writer, a tenured professor that lots of people like, that can talk openly with my students about
Mm,
my struggle as an alcoholic.
mhm,
Because I never experienced anybody in a position of authority, whether they be a family member or an adult friend or
Mhm.
parents, of my friends or something like that, and certainly never a professor that stood in the front of the room and talked about how that was just part of who they am. It's not the only part of who they are. It doesn't mean they're all fixed now. It's just part
Mhm.
of their life course and identity, and it's what goes
Mhm.
into navigating that. Because the fact is that, as you know, I mean, that's true of so many people. I'm not
Yeah.
unique in this respect. Everybody that anytime that we're in a room of a classroom, 30 people, 50 people, even 10 people, people are carrying all sorts of things into that
Yeah.
room. And I am, so let me spit out the point I'm making here, which is that it would have meant something to me as an 18-year-old to have a professor talk openly about their struggle and the reasons that they were attempting to live alcohol free,
Mhm.
not by saying that everybody had to do it or anybody that drinks is a sinner, nothing like that. Just like, this is a struggle that I have, just
Yeah.
at the same time as I'm struggling to write my book, as I'm struggling to be a good parent, as I, am struggling with processing terrible news while I, live in my comfortable home in the global north. I mean, this is one of those struggles. That would have been a resource to me as a teenager that I just didn't have. Now, would it have meant I was no longer an alcoholic? Would it have meant I just, stopped drinking recklessly? No, it's
Mhm.
so much more complicated than that. But it would have been a way of helping to grapple with the truth of what was happening with my drinking, and a moment of destigmatization of something that I think remains really stigmatized.
Right.
Um, and which is why I think I feel some responsibility as a person who isn't going to lose their job because they're talking about this openly, who has a loving partner, children, and family, to be able to add that little voice, that little perspective into the whole, as a modest contribution that is hopefully meaningful to others at the same time as it is to me.
Mm. So I one of the things that I appreciate about your essays rather on crisis is that you talk about the importance of correctly identifying crisis, like defining that concept, and maybe what we are calling a crisis isn't really a crisis. And one of the things that I absolutely appreciate about that is that you also sort of infer that there is a crisis that happens when we don't correctly identify a situation as a crisis. Um, and when we correctly identify a situation as a crisis, that sort of becomes the first step to walking out of it. But we have to be able to identify, we have to be able to accept that this is a crisis, and maybe just accept that and then begin to move forward from that. And so I think about that in relation to your struggles with alcoholism and how for years and years you were struggling with it, but it didn't quite resonate with you that this was a crisis until one day you were driving home and you just like sort of no, you were in transit home,
Uh-huh.
and then you just sort of realized, oh, I am an alcoholic. And I think that was such a powerful moment for me in the
Mm,
book, because I think until we can talk about what's going on in several parts of the world, we can talk about what's going on even here in Canada. Um, but I think there's such a surface level of acknowledgement that we collectively have about a situation. Whereas what would be most helpful would be to remove all of those coverings and go deep beneath
mm.
and figure out exactly what's causing what we're seeing at the surface. Because what's happening at the the at the bottom is the crisis.
Yes.
And so when you were talking about, acknowledging that this was a problem, like
Hmm.
you were struggling, with alcoholism, I I found that very, very empowering. And so
Mm.
even hearing you say that you wished that you had had something like this as an 18-year-old, I think I think that will resonate with a lot of people, is really what I'm trying to get at.
Mm,
And so that's why I sort of asked you, um, what has that impact been on? I actually had a question on what that has felt like, for your family, for your friends. But then I thought to myself, maybe the work situation is the one with the highest, amount of stakes. But I do want to sort of move away from that just a little bit. We can come back to that. And I want to talk about the form that you've written this piece on. So it's a book of essays,
mhm,
and it's very deep. It's very insightful.
mm,
It's very intellectually stimulating,
mm,
and it's not something that you see every day, which is why it jumped out to me when I first saw the blurb.
mm.
And we live in a world that's so fixated with ease and brevity. Like they tell you the emails have to be like 2, 3 lines, it has to be readable, it has to be easily scannable. But here you are quoting all kinds of scholars and just throwing yourself into one idea. How do you manage to keep up with your enthusiasm for academic essays on the human condition? And I'm curious to know what your expectation is when you're creating new work.
Mm. That's a wonderful question. Um, I'll have to think about my response, but you're raising something that I find really important, which is the question of form, engagement, attention. Because while it's true that I admire and learn from and enjoy reading lots of long form pieces, I am also a sucker for the listicle, the quick Q&A with an author and so on. And so knowing when to embrace an appreciation for the for brevity, for pithiness, for
Mhm.
a flash statement, a hot take, and when that's actually a sign of my eating too much intellectual junk food rather than the fuel that's necessary is something I think a lot about.
Right.
um but it's kind of a funny answer to the question of uh how to sustain, thinking about the book as being a deep a deeper dive than what's typical. Because on the one hand, that's true. Essays of 8,000 words or 9,000 words is longer than lots of
Hmm.
essays that are kicking around the internet. And yet, really, there's a way in which the book is actually it's a collection of things. It isn't just a single monograph, from page
Yeah.
one to the end with one
Yeah.
single through
Yeah.
line, one single thesis. And so it is eclectic or mixed in a way that I think is actually sort of telling of my
Hmm.
range of interests and perhaps my inability to sustain the kind of 300-page singular thoughts that academics should have.
Yeah, I mean, but I think, and I'm sorry to
No,
cut
please.
you off, but I do think that even though there are several topics in the book, like it isn't just about the one thing. The very fact that you could have sat down
Uh,
and said to yourself, I'm going to talk about this cup, and I'm going to go find a bunch of research to explain why the person designed it
yes.
this way
Yes.
and what makes it so. I think that is so not the world that we live in right
Yes,
now.
yes, yes. Okay, and what's interesting actually is at the same time, I hear what you're saying, and the fact that, and this was a challenge, that I'm recalling now. I haven't thought about this for a while, but okay, you're right, or I'm right. There's an essay about the ecological crisis. There's an essay
Yeah.
about my love of apocalyptic fiction. There's an essay about the crisis of democracy. One about crisis of drinking, but so that's mixed or eclectic on the one hand, but there is a demand that whatever it is you're going to talk about has to come, is to be rooted in this theme and explore. And you're
Yeah.
right. So I mean, part of that came organically. I think I started out with a series of things that were, I mean, as I said, it began with the most familiar political ideas and research to me around
Hmm.
the crisis of democracy. I knew wanted to had something to do with drinking, so that was going to be a piece of it. and so some other things appeared organically like that. But there was also a push to say, okay, what are the other ways that crisis gets talked about out there?
Right.
And could I write about that? Or
Right.
what relevance does it have to me?
Right.
Or is there a way I could take something that I've always wanted to talk about and draw it out through that lens? And so one
Hmm.
example would be, midlife crisis. I mean, I have not thought about midlife crisis prior to writing this book, but if you had, round of Family Feud where there was going to be 10 answers of crisis on the boards. Midlife
Yeah.
crisis is one of them, right? Like that's a
Yeah.
popular usage of the term. And but what was I going to say about that?
Mm.
And it wasn't immediate to me that that was going to be a story of my own experience through a tumultuous years in my late 30s, um, until I had thought more about a variety. Yeah, I won't go on and on about that particular essay, but like that was a combination of knowing that I wanted to be able to say something about midlife crisis and doing
Hmm.
readings into where does that concept come from. It's interesting that it was coined by a Canadian psychoanalyst in the 1950s and has a very um, uh, technical, somewhat restricted definition of what it involves. But then
Hmm.
there's all kinds of pop literature on what midlife crisis is. We see, these hackneyed representations of midlife crisis in pop culture,
Hmm.
and then bringing that together with some of my own passions around this certain book by Karl Ove Knausgaard, and thinking about my own life. I mean, that essay came together out of a variety of different interests in once. And so I admire when I'm reading the ability of an essayist to start one place and go in all kinds of different directions
Right.
and end up someplace that feels like it's been a journey and there is an arc and you can see how the various pieces hold together, and
Right.
yet it has been wandering, and there have been rises and falls in tempo or dynamics, and I guess I tried to do that. I mean, it was sort of a challenge I set for myself.
Yeah. I like that. I like that. I was just wondering if there was a part of you that felt that it may be too heavy for people to receive,
Yes,
because we're in a scroll generation. Like everybody's just like on to the next thing, on to the next thing.
yes,
Like, is there a fear that people might think this is too much for them?
yes. This is not going to be on the bestseller list.
Oh, jeez.
Well, no, but I just sorry, that's not supposed to, I'm going to say, but my publisher is maybe going to ask me that out. Mean, I guess what I mean is that I I write another way in which I write from privilege is that I write without the need to put food on the table through my writing. And so because I'm a full-time academic and I have job obligations that need to be fulfilled, and some of this falls into that and some of it doesn't, but ultimately I have the luxury of being able to write this and do so with a press and a publisher who is in full support of the project in all of its strangeness or hybridity or
Hmm.
idiosyncrasy, without telling myself this needs to make $100,000, or else I can't write another book or something like that. And
Right.
so I think what I'm trying to say then is that my primary question was, is this something that I find interesting and fulfilling? And I believe certain readers that are more than one will also find it interesting and fulfilling? And the
Right.
answer is yes. And when I
Right.
look at models like, for example, there's a great American essayist named Elisa Gabbert, who writes in a style and in a way that I am, really fond of, and I think has been hugely influential on my own approach, as well as, again, I mentioned Karl Ove Knausgaard, this Norwegian author that's a great influence on mine. And not only does he write this long memoir piece of autofiction about his own life, but also a book of essays that are in the tradition of writing longer in order to drive toward depth and texture, uh,
Hmm.
and trusting that there is an appetite for that, a hunger for that, um, even in the world of brevity
Yeah.
and Twitter.
Yeah. I mean, I love the fact that you mentioned that you are writing from a place of privilege, because I think that is not the case for a lot of people.
Yes,
And what the reason I love that you mentioned that is because what it then suggests to, at least to me, is that there's no there's no commercial expectation. There was no commercial expectation in your writing of it, so you could go as far as you wanted to go. You could,
yes,
you could research as far as you wanted to research. You
yes,
could investigate. You could ask, all the questions. You could be as honest as you wanted to
yes.
be.
Thank you.
You could open this thing as wide as it needed to be, because there's no the truth wasn't resting on the expectation of commercial success,
Thank you.
right?
That,
It
that
was
that's a really
it
nice
was
way of
just
putting it.
it was just flying,
Yes.
and it had wings to fly. So
Yeah. No, I mean,
I was just curious about that.
when I said, this is going to be on bestsellers list, that's not the way to put it. The way that you just said it is actually quite clear and concise, and doesn't have to rely on self-deprecation. But it's to say, to write from a place without commercial expectations and commercial demands is, I think, the place where the greatest human potential and the greatest
Yeah.
achievements and meaning happens. And unfortunately, we live in a world where those spaces are very, very limited.
Oh yeah.
It's very, very rare that people, whether they're writers or caregivers or athletes or musicians or anybody else, has the chance, the space and time to
Hmm.
explore their art, their passions, without commercial
Hmm.
expectations and demands. And
Yeah.
so I agree with you entirely that that is a precious space, and the more that we can expand spaces where people are able to do so, the better.
Yeah. And I mean, I think to me, it what it does is that it exposes a different type of crisis. There's the crisis of truth, or maybe it's a crisis of, maybe not truth, but a crisis of pseudo truth,
Mm,
because everybody has to survive and they have to do what they need to do. And if there aren't many spaces where we can really think about the things that are going on in the world and ask ourselves the deep questions, the because time is literally money, then there's the crisis of pseudo truth,
yes,
half truths, that
yes,
that is, I think, looming large. I had a conversation with a translator, an Indian translator and philosopher and scholar as well. And she was talking about the importance of artists having conversations that move us forward,
yes,
conversations that aren't hinged on commercial expectations or demands. And I think that is one of the things that regularly circulates in my mind. Like,
yeah,
we need I think it's very important for artists to be able to have that kind of independence, to be able
yes,
to do what they want and investigate truths.
yes, yeah.
So yeah, just
What you're
here I
just
am
saying.
going off on a tangent.
But no, 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 no. It's really interesting, and you know what? It reminds me of one of the usages of the concept of crisis, because one of the things that I say in the book is that uh, there are better and worse usages. There are ways in which people throw the word around that I think is problematic or useless. But that isn't to say there's only one accurate or acceptable usage. And what interests me is the varying ways in which the concept is applied, and sort of the work it accomplishes in pushing people to see the world a certain way, or to hide something
Mm-hmm.
from them. And so one of the ways that the term gets used is by this German historian. His name is Reinhard Koselleck, and he argues that the modern world, or modernity, exists in the condition of crisis. And the reason is,
Mm-hmm.
he says, because with the scientific revolution and the collapse of the authority of the church, and the belief in the perfectibility of the human condition, and our the potential to eradicate all of the problems that plague humanity, on the one hand, that shift toward the belief in the possibility, the imminence of perfectibility, and on the other hand, the failure to accomplish what is perceived to be the great promise of the
Mm-hmm.
modern age, places us in a condition of constant, chronic, ongoing, centuries-long crisis,
Yeah.
because there are these, incommensurable realities, which is the potential of achieving these Enlightenment ideals, and the failure to do so, the utter inhumanity and destruction and slaughter that actually is history. And so the reason I bring that up in relation to what you just said is not because that was um, the point that you were making, or that that's the way in which you were talking about crisis and truth. However, I do think that what you were pointing toward, I find really insightful, and I think convincing, is that there is this tremendous potential that people have, certainly artists, but others who don't think of themselves as artists, to
Mm.
work upon the world, to work in community, to innovate, create, share, experiment, um, uh, and that exists in all of us, and we get glimpses of it in incredible pieces of art, or in uh, 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 connecting with friends on a
Right.
picnic, or during um, a celebration, or a ceremony, or at morning at an event. Like, we know that we can do that as humans,
Mm-hmm.
and yet the demands of capital, the ceaseless flattening of commercial expectations, commercial demands, the rigid separation of who succeeds and who fails, and what
Yeah.
success means and what failure means. That that is, as you just said, like a place of crisis, a place of incommensurable realities
Yeah.
is extremely disruptive and alienating. And so I think that uh, I hear what you're saying, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. It is something that keeps me up at night.
Mm,
I worry about the future.
hmm
I worry what kind of art we'll be producing, what kind of music we'll be listening to, what kind of scientific inventions will be made. I mean, I think science will be fine because money loves science, science loves
hmm
money, they love each other. But I think other forms where people have to look, people have to birth something, right? And the birthing is been dictated by, by capitalism and
hmm
all these other things.
hmm
But anyway, so James, we're coming to the end of our
hmm
conversation here. But I wanna shift us to you now.
hmm
And I wanna ask a very simple question. Hopefully it's a simple question. So you are a writer, you're an essayist, um you are a professor. So you're always giving your words. So my question is much more than how your words can impact others, is how the words of others can impact you. And so my question, I know I said my question, but this is my question. What's the one thing that you want to be told now?
The one thing that I want to be told now in a book, you mean, or by you, or
By anyone, like, so you are, we're talking about crisis, right? We've been talking about personal crisis, social, political crisis, social crisis, ecological crisis. You've been, wherever you are, you're giving your words to other people. You're
mhm,
sharing from
mhm,
your deep thinking.
mhm,
If there's one thing that you want to hear personally, so it
mhm,
doesn't have to be anything academic or anything, what would that be? What would be the book that James would pick up?
mhm. That's a great question.
I know it's a heavy one because
I mean, the thing is that I know what the answer is, and
okay.
it's not, I don't think you'll be surprised, but it's a funny but I'm grappling with it because the funny thing is that this is what I wanna be told, but I know it's true, but I want to be told again and reassured again, and that has something to do with the refrain that another world is possible, that things
Hmm.
could not just could get better, hypothetically or in the abstract, but that there are concrete forces at play amid the wreckage of the crises that we're currently living through
Hmm.
that can and indeed we can have hope in changing the direction of the slide into authoritarianism, changing the direction and the course of ecological destruction, um, changing the direction and precisely what you said about the closing off of public spaces that are open for artistic and social experimentation and instead
Hmm.
being enclosed by the demands of the market. That when we say another world is possible, when we say there is hope, these are not just empty slogans, but um, uh, political orientation points that can
Hmm.
guide real rigorous understanding of the moment that we're in and what the future could be. And what's interesting, um, because it reminds me a little bit of therapy when you are explaining what the problem is, and then you basically realize that you have just sort of explained to yourself what the solution is or what to
Yeah.
do about it. Because the fact is that what I just described, I think, is at some level, I hope what my book is contributing toward. I mean, there are other
Yeah.
books that are far more technical in their sense of what political organizing or future movements and change might involve. And yet, at some level, the reason that I think that crisis is such an important concept that needs to be understood as something different than simple catastrophe, different than simple failure and loss and destruction, because those are meaningful, those are things. But crisis is different. The future is still open in moments of crisis. It
Yeah.
could be a path toward utter destruction and death, collapse, but there are alternative futures that are alive in the moment that we're currently living in which rebirth is possible, in which the growth and spread of democratic power and social justice is
Hmm.
possible. And it's from within these moments of crisis that, in order to be able to understand why they arose and what the different forces struggling within this period are comprised of, that we can, I
Hmm.
think, find footing in hope or in the potential of a more democratic, more socially just future, when things can otherwise seem overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. And I'm going to be thinking about that. Another world is possible. I mean, I think at the end of the day, um, even though we get a bit upset by the emptiness, and I'm putting this in air quotes, of the word hope, that's all we kind of really have sometimes. I mean, I think I'm thinking back to when you were just talking about people who are going through, crises that are um, injurious to the body, and there's a sense of there's no way I can get out of this,
Yes.
you know. But on the other hand, there are people who are able to navigate their way out of that, to a better place, whether that means that there's an intervention from someone who is an onlooker of crisis, and not really the victim or a participant in crisis. I think at the end of the day, what we need to know is that, maybe not what we need to know, but what we can know, what we can hold on to, is the fact that another world is possible.
Hmm.
So,
And we
thank you.
see people pushing for that and demanding to
Hmm.
try to bring it into reality, struggling on the streets of LA,
Yeah,
in Gaza, in the
yeah,
occupied territories, the indigenous struggles for sovereignty against colonialism in Canada. I mean,
yeah,
those are the concrete struggles in which that hope lives. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and for sure, yeah. I think that does. I think that's the foundation of what they do, is that they know that another world is possible. Because maybe hope is what actually keeps us moving, right? Like, if we had no hope, there'll be no struggle, there'll be no fighting. We'd just give in to the calamity, we'd give in to
Hmm.
the crises. But if you truly believe that another world is possible, then you step out and see what can be
Hmm.
done. So, but anyway, thanks, James. I feel like we could go on and on
So do I. I
about
have
this
really
topic.
enjoyed the conversation.
I'm glad.
I appreciate your questions and your insight. I really enjoyed it.
I'm glad. I'm very glad. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. And if you'd love to get James's book, In Crisis, on Crisis, there will be links in the description box for you to be able to get the book, as well as stay in touch with James. Well, thank you for joining us today. I hope I will catch you in the next episode. On the next episode, I'll be chatting with another inspiring artist. But before then, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me what you think about this show and this episode. Feel free to drop me a note here or send me a DM on Instagram at Journey of the Art Pod. Finally, please subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube, or follow and rate the show if you're listening elsewhere. Help me connect with other artists who need a dose of inspiration today. Until next time, stay on the journey of your art.